Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
Hey, thanks for joining us and welcome to Donnybrook. Lots to talk about given the news of this week. But first, we want to tell you that later we're going to talk to Tom Burnham, who's the shelter director at the Peter and Paul Community Services, who's going to talk about homelessness and the St. Louis region. First, let's meet the panelists who are assembled wherever they are, starting with the news director for the Big 550 KTRS, Wendy Wiese. Along with Mr. Bill McClellan, one of our founders. He's, of course, with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Along with one of the newer columnists at rawstory.com. And, of course, he's also the founder of the Riverfront Times, and you hear him on KTRS every week, Ray Hartmann. And from 97.1 FM News Talk and 590 AM and the St. Louis American, we all welcome Mr. Alvin Reid. Well, Bill, we're just a couple of weeks, less than 2 weeks away from the election. Sam Page is up for election as the county executive in St. Louis County. But at somewhat of a last-minute development, it turns out, it's been pointed out, that Dr. Page has been working at Mercy Hospital, even though county regulations say that the county executive shall devote his entire time to the duties of the office. Also, turns out he is the only person who is in charge of doling out the $173 million in CARES money from the federal government in St. Louis County. He got that from the county council. We know that earlier this year. And tens of thousands of dollars go to Mercy Hospital. So, one, is he in violation of the rules? And two, does he have a conflict of interest?
Oh, no, I would be very upset if the county executive were an attorney and were appearing in court and representing one side or another. But what what Dr. Page says he's doing, just on weekends doing some anesthesiology, I don't have a problem with that. Real world experience and being in a medical center during the pandemic, is it in violation of the letter of the law? Apparently it is, but I don't see it in violation of the spirit of the law. I don't see it as a conflict.
Well, first of all, I think it's terrific conflict of interest for him to have sole control over that money. And we're not talking about that. I agree that the county council was wrong. That's part of it. I mean, the county council really, the Republicans were right to want oversight on that point. What I thought was kind of outrageous about the story was the notion that this was going to be, that Eric Schmidt was going to be brought in, and that it was somehow going to be criminalized. I mean, that's ridiculous. I think the only issue, and by the way, if any attorney general is going to be brought in, it's going to be Rich Finneran anyway. It's not going to be Schmidt. But
we'll see, Ray.
But for real, I don't think that, it's a weekend thing. It doesn't bother me that much. I think the issue is, once again, honesty with Sam Page. He's made it very clear in all of his campaign stuff and in all of his, to my understanding, to the county council, that he was taking a leave of absence. He's been very specific about how he was taking a leave of absence to be a county executive, and this clearly is in conflict with that. I agree with Bill. It's a conflict in that respect.
Go ahead, Charlie.
I was just going to say, Doug Moore, his spokesperson, says the only reason he's working several shifts per month at Mercy is to keep up his accreditation so that he can volunteer time once a year in the Dominican Republic.
And that's certainly a very laudable part of all of this. My husband works for Mercy. That's not really a secret. My problem with it would be with any hospital when you're doling out CARES Act funding And especially, I go back to the way Dr. Page introduced himself to the county. He was the anti-stinger. He was going to be very transparent. He has 3 press conferences a week. Why I monitor every single one of them in their entirety. I have never heard him once mention this or disclose this in any one of them. So if you're going to either be transparent or don't be transparent, that's my whole part of all of this.
Yeah, I think I don't have a problem with him having kind of a side job. I do have a problem with having that side job because, like, never mind the COVID money. Mercy's got other contracts with the county, and and they're paying you. So I think it should work there, but I don't have a problem with him working. I mean, I wish most politicians, all politicians, had to have another job to make ends meet. We'd probably have a better run country.
Well, let me just remind everybody that when Tim Fitch, a retired police chief from St. Louis County, wanted to continue to collect his police pension and serve on the county council simultaneously, it was pointed out, you can't do that. You can't be working for the county council if you're getting a county pension. And so he had to give up the pension for the number of years he's serving. Right. And it seems to me, if we're going to enforce rules like that, then we have to enforce the rule that says verbatim that the county executive shall devote his entire time to the duties of the office.
Yeah, I don't really disagree with you, Charlie. In other words, I think now that it's come out, it's very possible that the county council or someone should point that out. The thing about it is being weekends, I don't feel like I'm not sure if I agree with the ordinance itself. I mean,
yeah, right. I agree.
Not a 168-hour a week commitment, but I think Alvin's point is really good, which is there's an inherent conflict with working
at any hospital, with his involvement with any hospital in the county, whether that's BJC at Missouri Baptist.
Again, it's not like he's doing anything wrong.
Right.
Here. I mean,
and he could have avoided. Couldn't he have avoided this by sharing the delegation responsibilities with the county council?
Oh, absolutely, Charlie, absolutely. And I didn't mean to let the county council off the hook when they said, when the Democrats on the council said, we'll let Dr. Page be in charge of everything. I think that was a terrible mistake. But I'm not blaming that on Page. Okay. I thought that was Lisa Clancy and her cohorts on the council.
Let's go to Alvin Reid for our next topic. Cori Bush, who defeated Lacey Clay, the incumbent congressman, and is most assuredly going to proceed to victory on November the 2nd, with all due respect to her opponent. Alvin Reid, said that she'd like to defund the Pentagon. Now, the Pentagon does spend about $730 billion a year. I think that she's onto something, that the Pentagon could use a haircut when you at least compare the amount of money we put in military spending to what other countries do. And I think that she's a little closer to somebody like President Eisenhower, who said, you should be worried about the military industrial complex. What do you say?
I say if she had said, let's go through the military budget with a fine-tooth comb, that's one thing. Defund the Pentagon is ridiculous. And it's just like Republicans who represent a congressional district that's just overwhelming Republican. They can say a bunch of silly and stupid stuff, and then we all get irritated by it. Not all, but, there's irritation about it. Well, this is the exact same thing. This is nonsense. It especially comes at the wrong time. And it lends no credence to her being, a viable congresswoman. Now, I'm sorry. I'm sure she'll do a great job. But this was a moment in, how do you say, tone deafness. And she's very guilty of that.
I think she deliberately, I think this was by design. She was retweeted by Bernie Sanders. It's gone halfway around the world, if not all the way around the world. So I do think this is the progressive movement. And to poke the bear certainly doesn't. I mean, I think, Alvin, you're so right. Language really does matter. And if she had said, yes, I'm going to look very thoroughly at the Pentagon budget, that's why this is so obvious that she knew exactly what she was saying.
Well, it sure doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, if she would have waited 2.5 weeks, she can say whatever she wants. But right now, everybody else on the left is just obsessed with winning the presidential election, and for Cori Bush to be out there, like Alvin said, saying silly things. Boy,
I don't think it's going to change.
I generally, oh, go ahead.
I don't think it's going to change the direction of anyone's vote. Do you?
No, and I was just going to say the same thing. She is who she is. She's a very progressive, very left-leaning congresswoman, or about to be. And I'm not that troubled by it. I agree generally with the point that it would have been preferable for her to wait. Keep in mind that if she didn't say that, the outrage machine on the right, which works much like the one on the left, would have invented it. And so it's not like A, that it's going to change anybody's mind, and B, if she didn't say defund the Pentagon, which I think she was sort of saying.
Well, wait a minute, Ray. You just said if she hadn't said it, it would be invented. She said it, and she has to own it. And that's it's you can't excuse her because oh, they would have found something else to go after.
Well, they would have.
Why did she say it?
I don't think it's a little bit like, I hated when they said defund the police. The point is a very, I think, awkward way to say we're going to rearrange our priorities. I don't even know she was that making it. I think if you look at the whole thing, if your day's going bad, I don't think it was even like some serious policy statement.
Okay, so in other words, she sounded okay. Who did she sound more like? And I'm not talking about the content, but just crazy talk. Who did she sound more like? Donald Trump or Barack Obama? That nonsense that Donald Trump is, spewing out. Why are any Democrat trying to match that? And that's exactly what she did.
I don't think it's nonsense. I'm with her. I think that, she could, like Wendy said, she caught our attention. She got retweeted by Bernie Sanders. Let the discussion begin. Ray, I want to ask you about
focus on getting approval. And so I don't disagree with the basic premise that the timing wasn't great.
Okay. Ray, people will be voting in a new manner. If St. Louis voters approval voting, which is Proposition D at the ballot box on November the 2nd. Essentially, let's say you have Bob, Carol, Ted, and Alice running for mayor. You can pick 2 of them, 3 of them, 4 of them, or just 1 of them. Top 2 vote getters go to the general election. And the idea is, let's keep the campaigning going where the politicians still have to discuss the issues beyond the primary. I think that's great, but I think this is a little unnecessarily complex. It seems to me we could just take the top 2 vote getters and go with that, as opposed to having, okay, pick 3 out of 4 or 4 out of 5 or 2 out of 5, whatever you want. What's your opinion, Ray?
I think people, and again, I don't live in the city, and I know that always a couple miles, but I absolutely think voters should vote for it. The key things it will do is, 1, it will make the city's elections for mayor, aldermanic, president, comptroller, and others, and alderman nonpartisan, which I think is a really important thing to do that 80% of America's cities have already done. So that's the first thing. And the second thing it will provide a runoff, which means instead of the March election, the general election being completely meaningless, as it has been for as long as I can remember, it will now have meaning. Now, is this the perfect way to do it? Who cares? It's like you're going to end up getting mainly 2 people out of the same field, and it's not going to materially affect it. If people don't like it, after they could change it again, I guess, in terms of that the process. At the end of the day, you're going to get the 2 top candidates, and they're going to have a runoff in March, and you're going to get rid of stalking horses. It's going to discourage negative campaigning. I think it's a great thing for the city.
But the aldermanic, the Black Caucus, they are very very opposed to this idea, and I don't understand why. Their claim is that this will be the dissolution of the Democratic Party in St. Louis.
That's ridiculous. It's so absurd.
I know. I agree. I think that Charlie is also right. It's unnecessarily convoluted, but it still gets us over the speed bump that really hinders us at this moment. So,
well, I'm sorry. Northside politicians are the Kentucky Derby of stalking horses. Listen, a lot of their income comes from just doing what they're told and trying to ruin somebody else's chances. And if you can eliminate that, and as far as what white politicians think in the city of St. Louis, to me, it's kind of a moot point because this is about the North Side. And those that are like fighting the hardest against it are those that find themselves in a situation where, they might not be in office because they're not deserving to be in office and because they have used their office as to to make gains instead of serving the community. I'm all for it.
I was wondering,
it's not just racial. I mean, Michael Butler's for it, who's the recorder of deeds. Tashar is kind of keeping her head down because she's so obviously effective, but I suspect she's for. Megan Green is for it.
Okay. Well, who is your favorite stalking horse, Bill? Was it when Albert Walton ran against Albert Walton, or when Clara Joe Rohde ran against Joe Rohde?
Well, I like Clarence Joe Rohde, but my favorite one was, I'm having trouble with names. Who was the politician who tried to outlaw sneezing in the legislature?
I don't know.
Do you remember him? Alvin, you might.
I'm trying to remember too, Bill.
He ran, he was accused of being a stalking horse for Vincent Shamel against a black opponent. I want to say it was Freddie something. And
Williams?
Fred Williams.
Fred Williams, that was it.
And Fred lost, of course, the election, but drew some votes away from Shamel's opponent, and he became the disaster czar. He had a little bunker, and he was in charge of what we would do if there was an earthquake. Yeah. And it always seemed so strange because a snowstorm, 2 inches of snow, can paralyze the city. And the idea that somehow our disaster czar would take care of it, but Fred was my favorite.
Let's move on to Wendy Wiese and another topic for discussion, and that would be Proposition 1 in the city of St. Louis, the residency requirement. As you know, Wendy, the legislature, along with the governor, approved eliminating the residency requirement for police officers, firefighters, and emergency responders in the city of St. Louis. They did that this fall. But this would extend to other employees, those who pick up trash, those who cut trees, I suppose those who work at the airport. And it would say that you no longer have to live in the city of St. Louis to have these jobs. The way I look at it, though, there are a lot of people who are unemployed in the city of St. Louis. Why can't we connect them to some of these city jobs and employ people who are living in the city? What's your opinion?
Maybe they don't want those jobs. Maybe they are not interested in those jobs. If you can't force anyone to stay in the city, if you try that kind of, if you take that tax, in my opinion, then you make them even more desperate to want to get out. I think conversely, you might have people coming in from all over the place. Who's to say that if the residency requirement is lifted for all of those departments and made permanent, as Prop 1 would, I think you're gonna bring a lot more interested people into the city to consider things that perhaps they hadn't considered before. And I think that if anything, you're going to make city dwellers feel like, hey, this is a pretty great place to be. I don't see it as a negative. I see it as a potential plus.
Are you sure the people who work for the city aren't going to move out? And in other words, the residents who are required to live in the city and are currently working, trimming trees or picking up trash, refuse division, they might say, hey, here's my chance to move to Florissant or Maplewood or wherever.
Well, Charlie, I will counter that with, when we talk about city versus county and all that, but there are people who live in the county and Metro East Side, they've lived there their whole lives, or their family's there, they have property there, and that's where they live. But they would never take a job in the city, not because they hate the city or don't want to have anything to do with the city, but because they had to live in the city. So given the option, like, hey, you can go on living your life wherever you live your life, your job is just in the city. So I think it would help attract people to work in St. Louis and pay the earnings tax and spend money in the city they otherwise wouldn't be spending. So I think that's the trade-off.
I think Alvin's right. And keep in mind, there's nothing keeping the city someday from giving people an incentive to work in the city as part of their deal. We've talked about this before for police and others. I think Alvin and Wendy are both right. I think you gotta, and the city's not a prison, Charlie. I mean, people aren't gonna flood out of there for that. I think nobody else, what other municipality in our area, what other county, whether other anything requires you to live there. And one other thing, keep in mind right now, the treasurer's offices doesn't apply to, the circuit attorney's office it doesn't apply to, all of the state offices you vote for in November in the city aren't even affected by this. So I think it's just way overdue to drop.
I disagree. I mean, I think with all the unemployment in the city, like, I walk in Forest Park every day and I see the workers from the city to forestry department, for instance, and I think they ought to live in the city. I mean, that these jobs should go to people who live in the city. The idea that, well, you can live in Jeff County and come in and get your paycheck in the city, I'm leery about that.
Should Ray and I have to live in Maryland Heights because we work in Maryland Heights?
No. I think the city is a special example just because the unemployment is so high there. I make exceptions for the police officers because apparently they can't recruit people. But I'm not sure that there should be an exception for the forestry division and the people who cut tree limbs down.
But Bill, a lot of I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think a lot of communities give a preference to their residents.
Okay.
And that's fine. And maybe an incentive even would be fine. But a requirement is, I think, a really negative statement about the city by itself. And let's say, as much as we know about the horrible crime situation, there's a lot of great stuff about the city of St. Louis.
Here.
Right.
That's right.
These jobs have been open for a long time.
And nobody wants to.
I don't know how you force someone to take a job.
And nobody's saying we want to punish the good people of Maryland Heights. Let's just be clear about that.
That's very cruel.
Ray, I want to ask you about kids getting back into schools. I thought Blythe Bernhard of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch had a great eye-opening piece on Sunday when she took a look at the home of 5 or 6 kids who are studying virtually. As it turns out, they're up till 1 or 2 in the morning, God love them, because their mom works at Wendy's. And then they have to get up 3-4 hours later to be online. They don't have breakfast. And the Wi-Fi goes in and out. We know how that happens. There aren't that many laptops in the home. The kids are falling asleep next to the laptop when they should be in class. And Bernhard points out that the teacher is teaching. Class of 20 students, 8 are showing up. Class of 15 students, 7 are showing up. It really doesn't seem to be working. Don't you think that those St. Louis kids should be in the classrooms?
It depends. I mean, first of all, it's a well-written piece. That's not the issue. I think that the question is a much broader one, which is, does one size fit all for going back to school? Everybody would prefer to have all the kids back in school. There's no question about that. But each community is still very different. I had on our air Byron Clemens, who's this organizer and spokesperson for the teachers union, and they're very concerned, and I think rightfully, that the pace might be going too fast. You do, among the stakeholders, as they like to say today, that have to be considered in this are the teachers and the other school personnel, not just teachers, who can be put and have their families put at risk if things aren't done the right way. So, yeah, and for example, a lot of it's about following the science. The science today indicates that kids up to about 2nd grade are really pretty safe. And if you do it right, you can protect everybody. And the city, I think, has been very laudable about how it's done it so far. But if they start doing things like changing the student-teacher ratios and doing a lot of stuff that's to satisfy the political winds out there, I think it's is not. I think you have to do this carefully.
Right.
You have to do it by district.
Well, let me make 2 points. First of all, Laurie Scrivan's photos were also excellent. I mean, that photo showing 5 kids on the couch with their little tablets and phones and obviously got nothing done. It was heart-wrenching.
Here.
But I have a grandson who's a kindergartner, and I've watched him do online class, and you're asking, no teacher can do that with kindergartners. I mean, Robin Williams couldn't do that. Keep those kids engaged for 6 hours. I mean, if you can do that, you ought to be playing the big room in Las Vegas. The very young kids have to get to school, I think. I mean, Ray's right.
And
maybe you can't be shoving the 5th graders in, but boy, I think the youngest kids have to go to school.
That's what I said. I think
Ray, NPR just yesterday had a piece where researchers in this country are showing that in classroom education is not spreading it, and in the cases of the teachers, they're not picking it up. And I think Art McCoy at Jennings, who has had his schools open all year, has pointed out that it can be done if you educate smartly, well, take care of all the social distancing and masks, etc.
Yeah, and he's got a smaller. Go ahead, Wendy.
I think the teachers, if they are members of the more vulnerable populations, and they have family members at home who might be exposed, I could see where they would be thinking, let's just slow it down a little bit. And they are the front line, and I think we have to listen to them.
Yeah, and Dr. McCoy is a great example. He is really, they've done it right. It looks, they're very proud of that. And that's one district that's done it right. And whatever variables they're dealing with, he's been able to do it. It doesn't mean that every other district can. I mean, and again, I think the goal should be for everybody to come back, but that's like saying the goal should be for all the kids to play high school football.
But Ray, the private and parochial schools have had in-classroom instruction.
Okay, it depends on the numbers. It's as simple as that. And in case anybody hadn't noticed, in Missouri, the numbers keep changing. We keep, this idea that somehow this is all behind us. We've set more records in this state this month for hospitalization and positivity rate and cases. Almost every day we're setting no numbers. So
just to get back to the city. Okay.
Hold on to those thoughts. Hold your thought, Alvin, because the unforgiving clock says we're out of time. But we'll be back on the flip side with Tom Burnham from Peter and Paul Community Services. So don't, under any circumstances, touch that dial.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network. Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
Well, thanks for joining us for the second half, and we're pleased to welcome to the program Tom Burnham, who's the Community Relations Officer for Peter and Paul Community Services. The topic, homelessness. Tom, welcome aboard. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be here.
We appreciate your time. Let me ask you how we're doing in St. Louis. I know that in some cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles, we hear reports that homelessness is really off the charts, and maybe with numbers that we haven't seen in previous decades. But how about here in St. Louis? How would you assess our situation?
Well, it's certainly nothing like they have in those cities, but it is still very much a challenge. According to the most recent point in time count last January, there's about 2,500 persons homeless in the metro area. That includes St. Louis County, St. Charles, Lincoln and Warren counties, and Madison and St. Clair counties. Now, that's according to a HUD definition, which is not the best definition. That's people who are literally on the street or in shelters or transitional housing programs. It does not include people who are couch surfing or temporarily housed in hotels and motels. So 2,500 is a serious undercount in my opinion. I mean, HUD has always had screwy definitions as far as I'm concerned.
Wendy?
We know that things have been challenging for the homeless community and the people who serve the homeless community way before March. But Tom, if you could speak to the impact of the pandemic and whether or not you saw a very dramatic sort of overnight impact when it comes to charitable giving and people wanting to help and not being able to help, or if it's been more gradual?
There were immediate challenges. At Peter and Paul Community Services, we typically work with 4,500 to 5,000 volunteers a year, and we curtailed our volunteer engagement entirely. And of course, that means raising expenses along the way too. We also made major changes in our programs themselves. I mean, when the Department of Mental Health mandated that residential care facilities go to a quarantine in place mode, we instituted those protocols across the board for all of our programs. And, for instance, we operated our shelter 24 hours a day. It's normally just an overnight shelter. We had to go through a period of attrition to get our numbers down to allow for some degree of social distancing. And this wasn't unique to us. This was across the board. At the same time, the St. Louis City and St. Louis County Continua of Care, those are the networks of providers working on issues related to homelessness and poverty. They opened up facilities to provide space for isolation and quarantine for individuals. I mean, we were fairly proactive, and I think as a result, none of our clients in any of our programs has come down with COVID. The city has been very helpful, making sure that protective gear, masks and stuff was available, and disinfectants and cleaning supplies. They also coordinated. They have brought the medical school at Washington University in. We have weekly conversations on protocols on how we can address this. And, there's been a lot of testing. It was really St. Louis County who stepped up with the quarantine and isolation facilities that are serving the metro area. This has been very much a collective effort. A few years ago, many of the continua of care in the region, we formed the St. Louis Area Regional Commission on Homelessness to look at this as a metro-wide issue. Homelessness is a metro-wide issue, and SLARCH, as we call it, has really come into play in addressing this again on a regional basis. It's had a lot of impact, and it's been kind of a work in progress as we're adapting to the new realities we're faced with.
Hey, Bill.
Tom, one of the new realities is the New Life Evangelistic Shelter gone, and you were a close observer during the years of the fights Reverend Rice had with the city. And when they shut him down, I thought it would be a disaster. Now you have a pandemic on top of it. How has the city and the homeless ventures been without Larry Rice there?
Well, uh, with or without New Life, the level of services in the community has never risen to the level of need in the community. Um, Certainly, New Life was a factor. I mean, they were routinely housing 130, and sometimes way more than that a night. Um, uh, there's been a lot of work done to bring other agencies and churches into the picture. For several years now, there have been a lot of so-called pop-up shelters that provide space for winter overflow. Some of those providers have stayed open since last winter. They've been continuing and ongoing, and there's been a real push throughout the region to bring more agencies to bear on that. It will never be sufficient, but we're doing what we can with what we've got, and trying to bring more resources to bear across the board. We're of course also facing a wave of evictions. It's probably already started. There's certainly been an issue of illegal evictions, but by the end of the year, the beginning of next year, we're expecting a significant wave of largely families being evicted. And, to that end, we are trying to bring together resources for prevention services and rapid rehousing to try and get ahead of the wave as much as we can.
Ray?
I hate to ask the dreaded two-part question. I want to follow up real quickly on something you said, which is you said that the HUD count was 2,500 in our region. If we use the Tom Burnham count instead of the HUD count, and included the couch surfers or some of the other folks you described, what kind of number would we be talking about? That's the first thing. And then I'd really want to ask you generally, where do you think the money can ever come from to bridge that gap you were talking about?
Well, by my definition, there's at least twice and maybe three times that 2,500 number, because I would count couch surfers and folks who are unstably housed in cheap hotels and motels. In terms of where the money comes from, we have always known that it's never going to happen on the government's dime. They certainly have a major role to play, and I think they could do better than they do. But across the board, again, we're trying to engage more with the private sector. We would love to find more bricks and mortar property developers who would partner with social service agencies like, say, BJC, for instance, to provide the social services to help people succeed in what I've always referred to as truly affordable housing for very low income people. There's a new program going to open up in North St. Louis. There's the Veterans Community Project. They're already in Kansas City. They're going to be opening up a campus with about 50 tiny houses and about a 5,000 square foot community center. I think it would be great. We could use a couple more of those for the general population. I think this is a model that would benefit a lot of people and the community if we could duplicate it around the area. One of the biggest problems for programs like this is the NIMBYism. We established a permanent supportive housing program 6 years ago in 2014. We spent 5 years searching for a location for that program. shot down by lack of aldermanic support, by neighborhood opposition. But we finally got it going. We have the Garfield Commons project, where Peter and Paul Community Services, we have our offices there, and 25 one-bedroom apartments, permanent supportive housing. We also have a couple of transitional housing programs in addition to our shelter and our meals program. And we're in a period of strategic planning right now, and we're looking at ways to expand on our shelter program and improve it. Improve all of our programs and services.
I want to go back to that number 2,500. Let's even double it. Okay, so it's like 5,000, and then the area that you described that 5,000 are in is probably pretty close to 2 million people. Okay, it seems to me that Charlie named other cities, and if we told them, said for every 2 million people we have 5,000 classified homeless people, they would say you're doing a pretty good job compared to what we have. So it seems like St. Louis, once again, has a problem that could be manageable, but yet seem like we're worse than other places with a population or based on ratio of our size. That's one that I don't get. And you kind of answered it, with what Ray was saying, but why can't we just handle this? Because we aren't talking about 200,000 and 300,000 homeless people.
It's in many respects, it's a matter of political will. There have been some changes that hold a lot of promise. The city has had an affordable housing trust fund since early on in the Slay administration. I think it's inadequately funded. It gets about $6.2 million a year. St. Louis County has only just created a similar trust fund, and it's going to be funded through a portion of the money raised from medical marijuana. I think it'll be interesting. We think these things are going to bear fruit and bring more money into the picture, and it would certainly help if the Affordable Housing Trust Fund in the city got more money. And of course, the city hasn't put any general revenue funds in the homeless services in years. I do think we do a pretty good job here. And there are things that we have done here which actually set a standard. Here in the city, we created the City of St. Louis Homeless Services Network Board in '96. And this was recognized by HUD as a best practice and held up for other cities around the country. This was a bunch of agencies coming together in the aftermath of the Graham versus Shamel lawsuit. I don't want to get too far down in the weeds, but we started to meet many agencies, not just shelters, to learn who's doing what and how can we work together, and how can we increase our efficacy. And in the late 80s, HUD held this model up to the rest of the country and said, you should be doing this. And today, every jurisdiction that is receiving HUD dollars for homeless services has a continuum of care. That model originated here in St. Louis. We also pioneered the Homeless Management Information System, the database. There are databases all over the country that gather demographic information and other related information on people who are homeless, so we can develop strategies and better qualify and quantify the issues that we're being confronted with, and better address them, make better and more informed decisions. Somewhere in the deep bowels of the city and county offices, There are certificates from HUD. They look like college diplomas. They're in blue leather-bound cases with gold embossed lettering, recognizing these innovations from St. Louis that are now nationwide.
Tom, I've been working in downtown St. Louis for about 32, 33 years, whatever it is. And I've noticed in the last year, it looks like there's become a new congregating area for the homeless. It's 14th Street, either along the Enterprise Center or across the street from it. And I'm just wondering, what's the magnet that has made this area the new place where people gather?
You know, the city plays whack-a-mole. You know, people gather in one area, they step in and move them on, and they simply go to another area. The fact is, urban centers historically have always been where persons who are homeless are going to gravitate to. It is the center of transportation. Um, uh, you know, here in the city, through the central corridor, you'll find a concentration of social services. Most of the providers for people who are homeless are within a mile and a half or 2 miles of Market Street. You know, from one end of the city to the other. Um, uh, it's something about cities inherently in cities that this takes place. You know, they were on Market Street. You know, you had the encampments on the North Riverfront, which was largely out of sight. Um, uh, you know, when it becomes a problem in one location, the city will step in, and it's going to move to another location. I mean, I'm not sure what the number is now, but when, you know, there were encampments on Market Street, there were actually about 15 different encampments around the city that had 10 or more people in them. Um, so I will also say this is a historic fact of life in the city that goes back to, you know, territorial days. You know, it is nothing new.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking mainly about the adult homeless population, and yet I think nothing is as effective when it comes to prompting people to take action as when we discuss the effects of homelessness on the very young, whether it is, you know, a fairly temporary situation or whether it is a prolonged situation. Can you address that, Tom, in terms of what you have seen and on the impact of homelessness on the very young? You mentioned the families.
You know, that to me, that's really heartbreaking. And I have always counted my blessings because I have worked primarily with unaccompanied men. When you're dealing with families, you're walking a tightrope. You have to maintain order within your facility. But you do not want to usurp the role of a parent in that situation, because once a child stops looking at the parent as a lawgiver, that is not something you can easily put back, if you can put it back at all. You know, I mentioned something about definitions earlier. The Department of Education uses a different definition than HUD does for homeless. By the Department of Education's estimate, there's over 6,000 homeless children in the city of St. Louis. There's a huge number of kids who change school at least once a year. You know, they're not socialized the same way. My parents were always together. I always had a place that I could go to, and I always knew, you know, who were the heads of the household I grew up in. And I think if you're a kid and you're bouncing between shelters. I think that is warping. Um, and I have known mothers with children who I once knew as children with mothers in shelters. I don't think we see that so much now, but that has been a persistent issue.
Tom, you mentioned encampments, and I remember a few years ago down on the river on the north side, there was Hopeville and Sparta, and they were growing and growing, and then the city came in and closed them up. Do we have any encampments like that now? I mean, do they organically sprout up for a while? Anything on the river where there's a bunch of people?
Nothing like that. I mean, the city counted 61 people. I know I spent a lot of time down there for, the 2 or 3 years those camps were there. And there were times there were over 100 people staying down there. Mm-hmm. Nothing on that scale. There are smaller encampments. In fact, there are people living down in that same area right now. But all along the riverfront, there have always been small encampments, sometimes 2 or 3 people, sometimes they get a little bit larger. The thing is, the folks who stay in those encampments, they generally are trying to stay out of sight. You remember those encampments began when repairing Tucker Boulevard was one of those shovel-ready projects at the beginning of the Obama administration. And there were people living in the railroad tunnels under downtown. There was a lot of folks down there, I mean, dozens of folks down there. And when they were moved out, they moved to the North Riverfront, and other people gravitated to join them. So you had it was hard to distinguish one from another, but you had people running 2 city blocks from O'Fallon up to Melanphy Street down there. Some of them looked very comfortable. I mean, some of those folks had generators down there, and others, were living in a little more than, lean-tos made out of trash bags.
Reid?
What sets Peter and Paul apart from other organizations that help the homeless? I mean, not to disparage them. Although, if you want to, it's Donnybrook, you can. But what seriously sets your organization apart in how you approach your work?
Peter and Paul started as a neighborhood response to a neighborhood issue back when you could buy houses in Soulard for hundreds of dollars. And I mean hundreds, not thousands. There were a lot of homeless people squatting in the neighborhood, and they would line up at the churches asking for food and clothes and blankets. 1980, a man froze to death about a block away from Peter and Paul. So volunteers in the neighborhood from obviously Saints Peter and Paul, from St. Vincent de Paul and Trinity Lutheran came together, and in 1981 opened a winter shelter. It operated 151 days from November 1st, from Halloween to April Fool's Day. So it was a neighborhood response to a neighborhood problem. Each of our other programs have grown out of issues and needs that presented themselves to us in the operation of the shelter. We saw a lot of acutely mentally ill folks. We set up what is now our LeBray program. That is a licensed residential care facility for folks with a major mental illness. In 85, 86, that was when they came out with the antibody test that would determine a person's HIV status before the onset of infectious diseases. And we walked with a lot of men to their death in that period. In the early 90s, we set up our Positive Directions program, which serves people. It's actually a rare one that doesn't have a triple diagnosis. They're HIV positive. They have a co-occurring substance abuse disorder, and there's usually an underlying mental health disorder also. That's a 20-bed program. And, for these programs, we have clinical teams involving licensed clinical social workers, occupational therapists, nurses, and substance abuse counselors.
Tom, we got to let you go now because that's all we have for this week's program, but we'd love to have you back sometime. Thank you for joining us, but more importantly, thanks for all the great work you're doing at the Peter and Paul Community Services. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.